Montana Territory, April 1878. The wind whipped through the empty main street of Dry Willow, slapping dust against the windows of the tailor's shop where Graceanne Parker stood behind the glass, her hands clenched in the folds of her apron. Her heart thudded, not from the chill outside but from the snickering voices of the two women who had just passed by. She should stop smiling altogether, one of them muttered, loud enough for Graceanne to hear. Those teeth could scare a horse. Graceanne turned away, her jaw tight. It was not the first time someone had spoken like that. Her front teeth were crooked, never fixed, never hidden. They had been the reason suitors passed her by at the town dances, the reason whispers followed her in the market, the reason she kept her lips closed more often than not. Her father, long buried on the edge of the valley, used to tell her, "Your smile is the sun, Graceanne. Let nobody teach you to hide it." But words faded. Memories faded. The sting of rejection did not. The bell above the shop door jingled suddenly, pulling her from her thoughts. "Afternoon, miss," a deep voice said. "I hear you do patchwork." Graceanne looked up and blinked once. A man stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, with dust on his boots and a saddlebag slung over his arm. His hat was pressed low over his brow, but when he tipped it back, she saw eyes the color of dark honey and a mouth set in a gentle line. "I tore the elbow right through," he said, setting the worn shirt on the counter. "Name's Garret Fletcher." Graceanne nodded, reaching for the shirt. "You are far from the trail, Mr. Fletcher." "I like the quiet," he said. "And my horse threw a shoe near the creek bend. Figured I'd stop in a day or two while the blacksmith fixes it." She glanced at the tear in his shirt, then took the piece to the back room without a word. She stitched in silence, but his voice followed her. "You from around here all my life," she said. "I run the shop alone now." She brought the shirt back out, neatly mended. "You're fast," he said, looking impressed. "What do I owe you?" 12 cents. He handed her a dime and a nickel, then paused when she looked up to thank him. His gaze lingered, not on her hands, not on her hair, on her face. "You smile like you are trying not to," Garret said plainly. She stiffened. "Most folks do not like what they see when I do," he blinked. "Well, those folks are wrong." She stared, unsure whether to laugh or walk away. He leaned just a little closer, voice low and calm. "That smile is mine now." Graceanne froze, her throat tight. "I do not understand." "I meant what I said." Garret's tone softened. "It is a good smile. I am claiming it if you will let me." No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not with pity, not with mockery, just truth. Plain and warm. She looked down, her hands shaking slightly. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was quiet, but the words were solid. He nodded once. "I will be around for a day or two if you need help carrying anything or if someone says something foolish again. Let me know." Later that afternoon, she watched him from the window as he walked down the street, his stride steady, his hat pulled low again. Garret Fletcher. The next day he returned, not with torn clothes but with a tin of apples and a question. "You ever go walking?" "Out toward the ridge," she hesitated, then stepped out from behind the counter. "Not in a long time." "Then come with me," he said. "The air's clear today." She almost said no, almost turned back. But instead, she reached for her shawl and walked beside him past the edge of town, where the hills rolled wide and the pines began to thicken. They did not talk much. He pointed out a red-tailed hawk. She showed him where wild strawberries grew in the spring. When they reached the ridge, she sat on a flat stone while he leaned back against a tree trunk. "You ever think of leaving?" he asked. She shook her head. "This place is mine, even if it does not always want me." He looked at her then, long and quiet. "I think it does," he said. Maybe it just never knew how to say it. That night, she could not sleep. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and touched her lips like the shape of them was suddenly unfamiliar. She did not smile often, but when she did now, she did not hide it. Over the next 3 days he came by the shop. Sometimes to talk, sometimes to carry the firewood in, once to fix the hinge on the back door. He never asked anything of her, but he watched her with a steadiness that made her chest ache in a way she did not hate. On the 4th day, she found him at the stables, tightening his saddle. "You are leaving," she said. "Only for a few days," he said. "There is a ranch west toward Elk Hollow. A friend needs help moving cattle." She nodded. "I see." He looked at her then, eyes soft. "You will still be here." Her throat felt tight again. "I do not go many places." "Good," he said. "Because I will come back." She stepped closer, the smell of leather and dust and pine on him. "Garret," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why me?" His brow furrowed, then he said simply, "Because you are honest, because you do not talk to fill the silence. Because when you look at someone, it is like you see more than just the surface. And because when you smile, it makes everything else feel quieter." Her breath caught. She had no words. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "I will be back in 5 days," he said. She nodded, her chest warm. 5 days. She could wait. She watched him ride out, dust trailing behind. When he disappeared beyond the ridge, she turned back to town, but this time with her head held high. The 5th morning broke late behind a curtain of spring rain. Graceanne opened the shop early despite the drear, the scent of wet earth drifting in through the warped floorboards. She lit the stove, set out her sewing, and tried not to measure the hours against the promise Garret had made. But she did. With every creak of the door, her breath caught. With every stranger's face, it fell. By midday, the hem of a widow's mourning dress had her needle busy. But her thoughts wandered back to the ridge, to the way Garret had stood, shoulders quiet, voice steadied like it had always belonged beside hers. The bell above the door rang. She didn't look up right away. "Miss Parker." Her fingers stopped. Garret stood in the doorway, damp to the collar, his boots dark with road mud. He held his hat in both hands like something sacred. "I would have come sooner," he said, "but the river swelled near Elk Hollow. I had to wait it down." "You're here," she said, setting her thimble aside. "I said I would be." She watched him step carefully over the threshold, not tracking in too much water. His eyes scanned the room, not for show, just taking in the small world she kept. "You charge extra for mending in the rain?" he asked, setting his saddlebag down by the stove to dry. "I charge double if you keep dripping on my floor." He grinned at that. Not wide, just enough to crease the corners of his eyes. He handed her a shirt with a frayed cuff. She studied it, then looked up. "You wear things out faster than most. You ever try riding through sleet with a stubborn gelding and 24 cattle that don't know north from their own tails?" She threaded her needle slowly. "Can't say I have. Then I'll save the stories for later." Evening brought a hush over Dry Willow. The rain slowed, and Garret stayed, helping chop kindling behind the shop without being asked. Afterward, they shared a supper of boiled potatoes and salt pork in the back room, seated across from one another at a narrow table. Garret reached for the tin lamp and turned the flame up a touch. "You made this table." "My father did." "Out of pine from the ridge before the fire took it." He nodded, running a hand along the worn edge, still holding strong. Graceanne sipped her tea. "He built things to last. You do the same," he said, voice low. "Only with people." She looked down, unsure what to do with that. "You ever think about building something new?" he asked after a moment. She set her cup down. "You mean a table?" "I mean a life." The room was quiet except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the popping of the stove. "I wouldn't know where to start," she said carefully. "With someone who sees you." Graceanne's throat tightened. She had heard kind words before, but never ones that asked something of her in return, never ones that waited like Garret's did now. "I'd have to think," she said. "I'll wait," he replied. "I'm not going anywhere without your say." That night, she stood at her window after he left, watching the lanterns in town flicker out one by one. The rain had stopped. The road was clean again, the air smelling of pine bark and wet stone. Her hand found the windowsill, steadying her. She had spent years learning to be still, to take up as little space as possible, to fill her days with careful stitches and let the rest stay quiet. But now there was a man who waited in the quiet, who asked nothing but her presence. Not her silence, not her apology. And Graceanne, for the first time in her remembering, did not want to be alone in that stillness anymore. By the second week of May, the cottonwoods along the creek had begun to leaf out, their green a soft hush against the sky. Garret had taken to stopping by the shop just before closing, not to linger, but to walk Graceanne home if she'd let him. She always did, though she never said the words aloud. That evening, the wind carried the scent of lilac from the preacher's garden as they walked the quiet lane between the last row of houses and the fields. The sun, low behind the hills, bathed the earth in gold. Garret carried a small bundle in one hand. "I found something out near the edge of the ridge," he said. "Thought it looked like trouble." She glanced toward the wrapped cloth. "A snake, worse," he said, unwrapping it. Nestled in the folds was a broken horseshoe, cracked clean through. She frowned. "Yours?" "No. Too small for my gelding. But someone rode hard and left it behind. Stage line doesn't come through for another 3 days." He nodded. "Could have been a drifter or someone avoiding the road." Graceanne looked out toward the distant slope. "You think they're still nearby?" "Hard to say. Could be nothing. Could be someone watching the town without wanting to be seen." She didn't ask if he was worried. His jaw was set, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. Instead, she said, "I'll keep the back door barred. Just in case." They walked a while longer, past the edge of the wheat field where the soil turned dark and rich. She stopped near a fence post and ran her hand along the top rail. "My father and I built this stretch," she said. "He let me drive the nails even when I bent half of them." Garret rested his hand beside hers. "You ever think about fixing up the house behind the shop?" She looked toward town. "It's drafty in winter. Roof leaks near the chimney." "I know where to find cedar shakes," he said. "And I've got a hand for carpentry when it's needed." She met his gaze. "Why would you spend time fixing something that isn't yours?" "Because it could be," he said, quiet. Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. Garret stepped back and gestured toward the fence. "I've been thinking of putting down roots, not just for a season, for good." Graceanne folded her arms. "You've been moving so long, I thought you didn't know how to stay still." "I didn't," he said. "Then I met someone who made stillness feel like peace instead of punishment." The wind lifted her hair. She turned toward him. "You don't know everything about me." "I know enough," he said. "I know you're steady. I know you see things most folks miss. And I know you've been expected to take less than you deserve." Graceanne looked down at her hands. "People don't forget what they've been taught to see." He stepped closer. "Then I'll teach them different." She didn't answer right away, only looked out toward the hills, where the sky had deepened into copper and violet. "You really mean to stay?" she asked. "I mean to build something," he said. "With you if you'll have me." She didn't speak, but her fingers closed slowly around his. They stood like that until the light faded, two silhouettes against the dusk. When they returned to town, the lamps had been lit in the windows. Graceanne paused at her gate, her hand still in his. "You'll come by tomorrow?" she asked. "Earlier, if you'll allow it. I'll be in the garden." Garret touched the brim of his hat, then leaned down and pressed his brow gently to hers. "I'm not leaving," he said. She didn't ask again. She didn't need to. By late June, the meadow grasses had grown knee-high, swaying with the weight of seed and the coming heat. Graceanne spent most mornings in the back garden now. coaxing rows of beans and squash from the soil her father once turned over with a spade dulled by years. The house behind the shop had begun to change around her quietly, without ceremony. A new porch rail, a patched roof, the window by the stove no longer rattled when the wind caught it. Garret worked without asking for thanks, rising early, tools slung over his shoulder, sleeves rolled past his elbows. He never lingered longer than she seemed to want, but he never left before she looked for him either. That morning she found him tightening the hinges on the woodshed door, his hat tossed on a stump nearby, his shirt darkened at the collar from sweat. "You missed breakfast," she said, leaning against the fence. He glanced up, squinting against the sun. "Didn't want to bother you. I boiled coffee. There's enough for two." Garret stood, wiping his hands on a rag. "I'll take it with a side of bread, if that's going." She led him inside, and they sat near the open window where the breeze carried in the scent of drying herbs from the sill. She poured the coffee, black and strong, and slid a plate toward him with a heel of bread and a dab of last year's apple preserve. Garret took a slow bite, then rested his forearms on the table. "Marshall rode through town yesterday," he said. Graceanne looked up. "Something wrong?" Asked if anyone seen a man traveling alone. "Light horse, northern saddle. Said the fellow's got a habit of vanishing when the law's close." "Did he give a name?" Garret shook his head. "Only said he might pass for decent if you didn't look close." She traced the rim of her cup with one finger. "You think that broken horseshoe belonged to him?" "Could be." "Could be someone worse." She nodded once, then said, "I've got a cellar key if you need it. I'm hoping we won't." They ate in quiet for a few minutes before Garret leaned back and asked, "Did you ever think about moving west of town?" Graceanne blinked. "Why would I? There's a parcel near the bend where the wild barley grows thick. No neighbors close, but the soil's good. Plenty of room for a garden. A milk cow, maybe." She sat straighter. "You mean for us, if you'd want it." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "It's not a thing I ever pictured, not really." "I have," he said, "more nights than I care to count." Graceanne let the silence sit a moment, then said, "I wouldn't know how to start a new life. I've only ever mended what was already here. Then maybe it's time to build something no one else touched first." She didn't answer, but her hand reached across the table, rested lightly over his. The skin beneath her palm was rough, warm, certain. "I'd need help picking the land," she said finally. "You'd have it." That afternoon, they walked the trail east of the creek, where the grass parted in soft waves and the insects hummed like distant song. Garret pointed out the rise where the sun hit first come morning. Graceanne bent to touch a patch of mint growing wild near a cluster of stones. "This could be a good place," she said, almost to herself. Garret stood beside her, hands on his hips. "You say the word, I'll start clearing by Saturday." She looked up at him, her mouth tugging at the corners. "You always so sure of what people want." "Only when they look at me the way you're doing now." Her breath caught just for a moment. "Then clear it." Garret's eyes didn't move from hers. "I will." They walked the rest of the way back without words, but every step felt like the first of something steady, something chosen. And that night, when Graceanne climbed the narrow stairs to her room and heard the wind tapping at the eaves, she didn't feel alone inside the quiet. The land would wait. The house would come. But the promise unspoken, solid, was already theirs. The land dried slow that July, baked in a stretch of heat that curled the edges of every leaf and left a fine grit on the kitchen floor no matter how often Graceanne swept. She didn't mind. The soil turned easier under Garret's spade, and the new foundation took shape with each passing day. He laid stone in the mornings while the sun still cast long, forgiving shadows, then joined her beneath the cottonwood at midday for a jug of well water and whatever bread she'd set to rise the night before. One afternoon, Garret stood back from the western wall, hands on his hips, shirt damp at the collar. "You ever think about what you'd hang on that wall once it's up?" Graceanne looked toward the ridge line, where the wind chased the last of the clouds. "Maybe a shelf for preserves. Or a clock if we come across one that doesn't lose time." He pressed his boot gently against the corner stone. "I was thinking a frame." She raised a brow. "A picture?" "No," he said. "A mirror. One of those wide ones with a carved edge. So you can see yourself the way I do when you stand in the morning light." Her mouth parted, but the words didn't come. Instead, she walked over and pressed a hand to the stone, her fingers brushing his. "Then we'd better find a good one," she said. That evening they sat outside the shop on the steps, a basin between them filled with peas she'd picked at dusk. Garret snapped the pods open with quiet rhythm, glancing up now and again as if he wanted to speak but wasn't sure how. Graceanne didn't rush him. Finally, he said, "There's something I ought to ask you. I've waited because I wanted to make sure it was the right time." She stopped shelling, her hands still. "I've put in half the work on that house," he continued, "but I don't want it to be half a life. I want to build the rest of it beside you if you'll let me." She looked at him, her eyes steady. "You're asking me to marry you." "I am." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into the basin and plucked the last pod, split it, and dropped the peas into the tin bowl. Then she set it down carefully beside the door. "I've spent most of my life being looked past, Garret Fletcher. I stopped expecting anyone to wait long enough to see what was worth keeping." "I never looked away," he said. She lifted her gaze to his. "No. You didn't." Then, without another word, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, her hand resting lightly on his chest. "Yes," she whispered. The wedding was quiet, held under the cottonwood where the dirt path curved behind the shop. The preacher's wife brought wildflowers gathered from the river bend, and Graceanne wore a dress she'd sewn herself, simple calico, soft blue, the hem just brushing the top of her boots. Garret wore his best shirt, the collar starched for the first time in months, and he hadn't stopped smiling since she'd pinned a sprig of mint at his lapel. After the vows, he took her hand and they walked together to the new house. The porch wasn't finished, but the door hung straight, and inside the boards had been swept clean. In the corner sat a small wooden rocker, a wedding gift from the blacksmith's wife. Graceanne ran her hand over the back of it, then turned to Garret. "We'll need a second chair," she murmured. "Already planned for it," he said, lifting a bundle from behind the door. Inside was a cane-backed rocker, the seat woven fresh from creek grass. She laughed then, soft and full, the sound curling up into the rafters. That first night they ate cornbread and roasted squash by lamplight, the windows open to the warm breeze. Garret cleared the dishes while Graceanne washed, their motions quiet and easy, as if they'd been doing it for years. Later, as they lay in the narrow bed tucked into the corner, she traced the line of his knuckles where they rested across her waist. "You never asked about children," she said softly. He didn't move. "I figured we'd speak of it when it felt right. I think I'd like a child with your eyes," she said, "and your steadiness, the way you listen." He kissed the place just below her ear, then said, "Then we'll hope for that." Summer wore into fall. The house gained curtains, then shelves, then a stove that kept the whole room warm through the first frost. Graceanne filled jars with late peaches and green beans, lined them along the pantry wall. Garret built a bench for the porch and carved their initials into the underside, where only she knew to look. One evening, as the leaves began to turn and the hills glowed copper in the low light, Graceanne stood at the edge of their field, her hand resting on the slight curve of her stomach. Garret came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "A boy or a girl?" he asked. "I don't mind," she said. "So long as they know what love looks like." "They'll see it every day," he said, pressing his lips to her temple, and they did. Through each season that followed, through the first cries of a newborn in winter, through the planting of a second garden, through the long days and quiet evenings woven with the kind of peace that has nothing to prove, Graceanne never again wondered if she'd been seen. And Garret never once looked away. They built their life one day at a time, not fast, not loud, but solid and lasting, and they were happy. Truly, deeply, and always.